Welcome to Afrolantican Jurisprudence. I'm your host, Andre Smith, Dre Smith, or Smitty Bonton, whichever you choose, as I know many of you from many different stages in my life, and of course, some of you I'm just meeting for the first time. The purpose of the Afro-Atlantic Legal Center, which this is, the Afro-Atlantic Legal Center, the purpose of this website and these videos is to discuss law, legal theory, and architecture, as well as its political consequences from an Afrocentric and Black nationalist perspective. While I enjoy what's commonly referred to as critical race legal theory, I do consider myself a member and a proponent, but law from a Black nationalist perspective departs from critical legal studies and critical race theory in some important respects, particularly with respect to formalistic interpretation, otherwise called textualism, and there's also intentionalism, and formalistic realism. In other words, critical race theory has a somewhat of a tension with law and economics that a Black nationalist jurisprudence probably would not. They would probably more embrace some of the law and economics constructs, although it still would be concerned about anti-subordination. Right, and so that's what we're going to do here is try to meld or marry the two disciplines as far as critical race theory, anti-subordination law, along with law and economics and other formal legal architecture to come up with constructs that prevent subordination, that become something of our negotiating point in this public choice environment. See, back in legal scholars such as Jerome McChrystal Culp, one of the greats, and others have suggested a Black jurisprudence previously. In 1991, Professor Culp complained a true Black legal scholarship has been woefully underdeveloped. More than 25 years later, not a lot has changed, and we intend to change that here. Okay, here we will engage in what I will sometimes call constructive race theory, the construction rather than the criticism of legal rules toward the prevention of group subordination. While critical theory tends to be concerned about how current legal rules reinforce racism and other types of subordination, gender, sexuality, etc., constructive race theory or a Black legal scholarship, in my view, imagines how Black people might construct law once self-determination is achieved. In other words, instead of looking at it from a law from a position of inequality, of disadvantage, how would law look if things were actually fair, or if Black folks had whatever requisite amount of power and self-determination? So think about in the second chapter, the reason why this is called Afrolantican Jurisprudence is because in the second chapter of Faces at the Bottom of the Well, a famous book by Derek Bell, is also what sent me to law school and my whole legal career and whatnot. But in the second chapter of Faces at the Bottom of the Well, Derek Bell asks us to imagine a volcano erupting in the Atlantic Ocean. The lava flows, a landmass forms, and for whatever mystical reason, on this island halfway between Africa and America, only Black people can breathe. Now, in his book, he was discussing expatriation and the interesting phenomenon that when Black folks talk about leaving the United States, they're told to go, we don't need you, or if you don't like it here, leave. However, when Black folks do expatriate, they're painted as crazy, as ridiculous, and even movements such as Marcus Garvey is thrown in jail for trying to defraud Black people when he clearly honestly was in fact trying to build a community of African Americans in Africa. So that's where Derek Bell was focusing. I focused on something a little different. My question was, had we gone to Afrolantica, or had Afrolantica come to fruition and folks left there, what's the law then? What's the system then? Right? If we're dissatisfied with the system here, we wouldn't want to leave here to go to someplace worse. We would be looking to go to someplace better. Right? The goal simply cannot just be a Black system. The goal has to be the better system. The one that, and what does better mean? The one that more faithfully distributes goods and services based on a clearer and more faithful standard for merit. That's every society is trying to do. And so while coming from it from a Black perspective, this is a universal quest. Whether the system is for Black, whatever the system should be for Black people, is also the better system for the United States and the world. In a so-called public choice environment where every group or faction is not only entitled but required to fight and compete for laws and regulations that favor their group, Black law professors and commentators should coalesce around more concrete proposals for what law, jurisprudence, and legal architecture should be in the future. That is what this entire project is about. And it's going to be a very, very long, hopefully fruitful conversation. But constructing the better system has been my aim for the last 25 years, including my entire time served as a law professor. So, as a law professor, before we continue, I want to quickly give you my resume, tell you what I've taught, where scholarship that I've produced and whatnot, just so you can kind of get a sense of where I'm coming from and the perspective I'm coming from. On top of that, or after that, I'm gonna give you something of a production schedule. Right, this is kind of the list of videos that we're going to produce in the next year or two. A whole lot of them, so I'm going to have to get busy. But even by the titles, you should get a better understanding of what, and hopefully excited about the things that we're going to talk about, because these are subjects that come out of law school and academia. However, to be perfectly honest, they are actually subjects that you're going to be more interested in than most folks in academia. I found that to be true over the last 14 years, that when it comes to when we present things about race, taxes, justice, and what have you, while there is polite applause in academia, I find that you guys are really even that much more interested and are thirsty for the knowledge that we have up in the ivory tower. So it's our job to now bring it to you all. So what ivory towers have I been in? I just completed 1 year teaching at the Howard University Law School. This is my alma mater, teaching contracts, federal income tax. I am a tax lawyer, or a tax scholar. So my view of race is through economics, and then even more specifically taxes. So we'll talk about race, taxes, and economics throughout these episodes. And so, yes, that is my background. Prior to teaching at Howard, I was asked to teach in an emergency situation. So I was what's called a visiting associate professor at Howard this past year. Prior to that, I spent 6 years as an associate professor at the Widener University Law School, or what's now called the Delaware Law School at Widener in Wilmington, Delaware. Prior to that, I taught for another 6 years as an assistant professor at the Florida International University down in Miami, Florida, FIU, stand up, enjoyed my time there as well. And my teaching career actually started at the Penn State University in Dickinson out in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Carla Pratt and everybody, hello, loved my time there as well. So I spent 14 years teaching traditional law school classes, federal income tax, and what have you, every year. Administrative law, which is the basic structure of the government. Once you get past the Constitution, you can call it Constitution Light, or you can call it how to fight or defend the government. So I'm also basically an administrative lawyer, tax law, and my fun stuff, my hobby, my other life is through sports and entertainment. So I also taught sports and entertainment law for about 14 years. And we'll get to issues like that. I know some of you think that might be more fun, but trust me, race and taxes is a whole lot of fun, or at least it's interesting. I hope to keep your attention with it. Prior to teaching, as I mentioned, I'm a graduate of the Howard University Law School. I have also a master's in tax law from Georgetown University Law Center. I was the first African American male, the first black male clerk at the United States Tax Court, the third African American person. Shout out to Karen Van Horn and those that preceded me. I clerked for the Judge Maurice Foley, who was the first African American tax court, presidentially appointed tax court judge. I interned for Judge John F. Dean, who was the first black special trial judge at the United States Tax Court. So those folks had a very profound influence on my career and my trajectory and getting me introduced to taxation, and how far and how deep the rabbit hole goes, how far you can actually get when it comes to taxes. It's not about filling out returns. I don't even like doing my own tax returns. Can't stand it. That's not what we're doing here. We're not crunching numbers. We're talking about the legal architecture and how the law and taxation either promotes white supremacy or racism or group subordination, or how we can use taxation, economics, and whatnot to elevate and towards black self-determination and equality with respect to both not just life, not just liberty, but also property as well. So I've written several academic pieces. In 2015, I published my first book, Black Tax, the relationship between tax law and racial economic justice. Many of the subjects that we talked about there, we're going to be rehashing, or I'm going to discuss with you also, hopefully buy the book. It was published on Rowman and Littlefield. However, if you don't buy the book, we are going to talk about a lot of the major themes within it. I've also written, I don't know, 15 law review articles. As a matter of fact, I'm still currently publishing. In 2017, I'll be publishing Deferential Review to the United States Tax Court, the Chevron Doctrine, in the University of Virginia Tax Law Review, or the University of Virginia Tax Journal. So I'm still active as far as publishing scholarship in mainstream academia. However, when it comes to race and taxes, it's a subject that I find has a lot broader appeal, and is probably somewhat, maybe even a little more welcome here out in the cyber world than perhaps in academia. But let's not suggest that what I do is totally unwelcome, or critical race theory or black scholarship is totally unwelcome within academia. I did publish, my first articles were on boycotts, racial boycotts, and suggesting that we should be concerned about, number one, economic justice. That's always my theme, economic justice, and that sometimes private protest can be more efficient than public protest, or basically activism towards new legislation or lawsuits for discrimination, etc. That sometimes good old private protests, such as boycotts and economic union, is the strategy that is probably most beneficial, considering the scarce resources we do have as Black people. I've also, again, one of my sticks as far as jurisprudence and race is concerned is that I try to meld critical race theory and law and economics. And so I have a conception of racism as asymmetrical market imperfections. We're going to break that down a little bit later. But again, racism as asymmetrical market imperfections. Many of you have heard lots in your life that, oh, it's just the free market. It's not racism, it's the market and whatnot. And that's supposed to absolve the situation and suggest that you're crazy for thinking that racism was involved. However, a free market, first of all, there is no such thing. But to the extent there is supposed to be a free market, it requires four things. It requires that everybody be a profit maximizer. It requires that everybody be able to enter or leave any market they so choose. That's called perfect competition. It requires that everybody have perfect information about everything. That's absolutely ridiculous, of course. And it requires that there are no transaction costs. So if everybody's a profit maximizer, if everybody can enter any market they want to or leave any market they want to, if everybody has information about everything and everybody, and if there's just no transaction costs like crime or environmental waste or whatnot, then the market distributes goods and services fairly. Okay, but what world is that? So the world that we're in, we know that information is imperfect. We know that you can't, because of capital or the lack thereof, or the inequitable distribution thereof, that not everyone can enter any market they choose, or even leave certain markets that don't serve them well. We know that there are plenty of transaction costs like environmental waste and what have you, and that they're spread out disproportionately amongst different communities. And we also know that certain people are encouraged to seek profit while others not so much so. So to the extent we already accept within this country that where those free market tenants are lacking, that it is the government's responsibility to fill those gaps. So it should be of no surprise that we also should argue that to the extent those imperfections in the marketplace, those imperfections in the structure of a perfectly free market, To the extent they are asymmetrical between race, to the extent black folks, to the extent any phenomena disproportionately puts transaction costs on black people versus others, to the extent information about black people or available to black people is asymmetrically imperfect, to the extent we are further discouraged to compete, to the extent we have intergenerational wealth inequality. All of those means that the market itself is structured in a way that does not produce merit, that it does, in fact, reinforce group subordination, i.e., racism, i.e., white supremacy. So that is one of my main constructs as far as jurisprudence is concerned, that when it comes to the equal protection clause, that when we discuss racism, that we don't limit it to discrimination, that we don't limit it to dignity claims, that we address mechanisms within the marketplace that produce asymmetrical market imperfections relating to race. And it's transportable. We would also want to address asymmetrical market imperfections relating to gender, sexual orientation, any identifiable group, if that's what we're trying to produce in our society: fairness, merit, economic advancement, a free market. If that's truly our objective, then I don't see the resistance to fixing the market in a way that promotes black folks, ends group subordination, and increases the GDP of the country. We're talking about Derek Bell's interest convergence theory. It all comes together. We're going to talk about that stuff a lot. I also have a strain of scholarship that deals with jurisprudence, statutory interpretation, administrative law, and structure. So how we make decisions. We're going to get a little philosophical about what what is the thing, how do you interpret a document, what do words mean. All of this is basic. You have to get very deep in order to call it a jurisprudence, to make it consistent from the kernel of what is a thing all the way through what are things, right and wrong things, to what is law that regulates things, to what does law do to promote race. Is race a thing? What is it to end group subordination as that thing? So we are going to get very deep into philosophy in some of our videos, so that we can make sure that what we're proposing on the back end, as far as legislation or a construct or whatnot, is consistent, not just with the politics, not just with the consequences, but with the basically the form that is consistent with our conception of things all the way to the beginning, so that there's less and less and less and less criticism or inconsistencies in our theory, and hopefully that allows us to promote it even faster. I've also written other things, such as in book chapters that aren't necessarily formal legal scholarship. So I also write on hip hop and the law. I go back. I'm 47 years old, from West Philadelphia, born and raised in the playgrounds, spent most of my days. I grew up on hip hop. So I also have written more than one piece on hip hop and the law. One of them, other people's property, hip hop's inherent clashes with U.S. property laws and its rise as global counterculture. I've also written a piece called "If Hip Hop Is Dead, Did the Law Kill It?" How over restrictive interpretations of copyright laws promote sex and violence in hip hop music. So we're going to go through a lot of varied topics here. Hopefully a lot of this stuff will interest you. My sports fans, how are you out there? Because I've written on sports and the law as well, always definitely with a sort of a nationalistic or concern for black people. So I've written about the NCAA, the NBA age limit, the illegal price ceiling of the NCAA with respect to athletes, and it's basically divesting them of property that they own and redistributing it to others. It's a huge component of racial injustice, especially when it affects some of our highest earners. So if you're concerned about black GDP, if you're concerned about whether or not black folks have an equal or fair amount of capital, enough to determine or fully participate in the United States of America, then we have to be concerned about what's happening to athletes, especially those that have a very lucrative skill. Further than that, I guess again taught administrative law. So one of the projects I'll be working on is the United States Department of Sports. It's just basically a trope to help teach. So I have lots of other books and articles that are coming up. I do consider myself a writer, whether it's in academia or not. As I mentioned, I will be publishing an article on the United States Tax Court that I believe the Supreme Court should or will cite when the issue comes before it, because I think it will come to a head. I don't think there's anything problematic about the Article 2 bureaucracy, and I don't believe there's anything wrong with the Chevron doctrine as a mechanism to decide cases, and therefore its application over the tax court because of its expertise to me is a no-brainer, but we'll see. I also have other works that I'm working on, again, as far as race and taxes. This year, 2017, we hope to publish Race and Taxes in 21st Century America. The subtitle of that is how Starve the Beast created the Black Lives Matter movement. So I know you're going to be interested in that, and we're going to talk about that a little later. There's also the culmination of this work that we hope to finish, let's say in 2018, Afrolantican Jurisprudence. So not only will there be a series of videos, hopefully it culminates in a book or treatise discussing lots of various issues. Do I pretend that we're going to come up with the answer? Hell no. So I'm going to come up with my conception. I hope as you come along, you disagree, and not just disagree and criticize what I'm doing, but also use your criticism of what I'm doing, what others are doing, to then construct a better system that you would promote that we ought to have. Who knows where this answer is going to come from? Right, that's also part of being philosophically pragmatic. After that, we're going to talk. I'm probably going to write a book about Afrolantican tax structures. So basically, what were the tax systems? We're going to talk about the jurisprudence here, but later we're going to talk about what the tax systems of Afrolantica are. And again, I know this is taxes and everybody hates them, but if you think about it, how do you have a public school system? How do you have a functioning hospitals? How do you have social support systems without a tax system? And if you do have a tax system, who gets taxed? How much? Goods and services, income, and whatnot. We criticize the tax system here because we're more or less subject to it, and we get disproportionately low benefits from it. But again, in the Black jurisprudence, if this were Afrolantica, what would the tax system be there? Would tax cuts for the wealthy, if it promotes jobs, would that be okay then? Or would we still be looking to tax in a more progressive or even socialist manner? Again, taxation support is an integral subject for when you're discussing socialism, capitalism, any type of government system. It has to be supported. So we're going to talk about all of those things. We're going to write about all of those things. And so before we close out, before I let you go, what I'd like to do is now give you basically a production schedule. This is the very first one, our introduction, hello, to Afrolantican Jurisprudence. But where are we going hereafter? Well, after this, we're going to talk about lots of subjects dealing with race and taxes. They do relate to my book, Black Tax. They do relate to the second one, Race and Taxes in 21st Century America. And then after that, we're actually going to go to law school. We're going to start talking about maybe perhaps straight up constitutional law, straight up jurisprudential law, for those that are interested. I know not everyone has the time or the finance to fund law school. I have great many friends of you that are hopefully watching this video that I went to high school with, that I went to college, and you're supremely intelligent individuals. However, circumstances are such that right now, no, you cannot drop everything and go to Temple or wherever the case may be and spend X amount of dollars learning the law when you don't even want to really be a lawyer in a law firm. So where do you go to know this system? Why, if ignorance of the law is no excuse, then why do we require people to be 23 years old and spend $100,000 to learn it? It's kind of backwards. So that's one of the functions here, is to bring, instead of for you to go to the law, I'm going to bring the law to you. We'll find some ways later to spiffy up the production, to make me better at it, and to try to make this a little more interactive instead of me just talking into the screen. But for right now, hope you enjoy where we're going so far. So that's where we've gone so far, and where are we going to? So here's a list of some of the topics, the videos that you should be looking forward coming in the future. If you are dialed into Afrolantica.com, that is going to be our official website. There's also going to be Afrolantica.com on Facebook. So this production schedule will be posted then. Hopefully you'll be anticipating these videos, and hopefully you'll also watch, share. Please share. You don't have to ask to share. Please, please, please share. At a certain point, we are going to start a YouTube channel, and at that point, maybe there'll be a subscription or something like that. But for right now, no, we just want to get this out to the people and talk amongst ourselves about race, law, and taxes from an Afrocentric or a Black nationalist perspective. So, where are we going from here? All right, so the first thing that we're going to do after this introduction, as we talked about my resume, the purpose, and the goals, our next video, we're going to actually talk about defining Blackness, defining Black nationalism, and Afrocentricity. If this is the perspective that I'm bringing, or the perspective I suggest that I'm bringing, then I think I ought to define it, or at least tell you what my definition or what I'm thinking when I say Black, Black people, Blackness, Black nationalism, Pan-Africanism, Afrocentricity. Right? We're going to talk about some other concepts there, but I think that's where we're going to start as far as setting up the rest of the conversation about race and taxes. After that, our third video that we're going to discuss will be on economics versus justice. Most of my colleagues in law school focus on justice in a kind of more abstract manner in terms of freedom of liberty, as far as human dignity. Very few, not none, but very few, in my opinion, focus on economic inequality. And not so much in a comprehensive manner. And so many of the constructs and phenomena, legal phenomena, are discussed with respect to their abstract rightness or wrongness, with respect to dignity and other values and norms, whereas my approach, I accept all that. I have no problem with that. I have no issue. I have no criticism for that, other than the fact that we have limited resources. And so equality has to mean equality, not just in liberty, but also in property. And when it comes to inequality in property, we're talking vast. If there's any, after the Civil Rights Movement, after the Civil Rights Act, to the extent de jure equality is here, economic inequality is going to be that much harder. And without reparations, without other ways to level the playing field, we're fighting an uphill battle. And so to focus on liberty is important, because we have to have a society set up in a way that allows us to flourish economically. However, we can't hyper focus on liberty to the exclusion of economics. And I find that sometimes some of us have, because we are in the subordinate position economically, reject economics. And I don't think that's wise. There's nothing that belongs to them. Right, that's also part of Afrocentricity. If we know our history, we know that there's absolutely no construct on the planet, including economics, that belongs to them, that we did not participate in help creating, and therefore there's no purpose to reject it, other than whether or not it helps us fight white supremacy or not. Our fourth episode, the fourth episode or chapter, will be called Afrolantical Wait, the Better System, Philosophically Pragmatic and Autopoetic. So many of the things we just talked about now, what would be the law in Afrolantica? What would be the economic system in Afrolantica? That's where we're going to get deep into the theory of even what is a thing? What are things? What is it to be? What is the law specifically? What is it? Right? And so we're going to talk about law, blackness, the definition, who gets to decide whether something is law, who gets to decide whether something is black. You know, the interesting thing is, because I grew up hip hop, think about it. What is it? Right? In our lifetimes, if you're old as me, we participated in the creation of a thing, hip hop. So what is it? Who gets to define it? Do I get to define it? Do you have to be from New York to define it? Does the whole world get to define it? Does it just go entirely without definition? Is it anything anybody wants it to be, whoever says that they are part of hip hop? What does that mean to even be part of hip hop? That goes into the definition of what hip hop is. So if it's that deep with respect to hip hop, imagine now that we're talking about what is the law. what is race, what is blackness, what is Afrolantican jurisprudence. And I suggest that, first of all, we need to be philosophically pragmatic and then also see law as an autopoietic system, that it is alive, that the formality creates the bones and the structures, that the mechanisms we put in the law allow it to see outside itself, and yet anything that is alive cannot survive if it's not cognizant of the world around it and at least somewhat influenced by it. So that would be episode, is that 4? I think that's 5 at that point, right? And then episode 6, we're going to talk about equal protection in Afrolantica. And this goes back to my point that if I am a Supreme Court justice in the state of Afrolantica, then yes, I would argue and try to get my other fellow justices to agree that equal protection should include the examination of whether law or regulation skews the market asymmetrically, whether it causes asymmetrical market imperfections with respect to race, gender, sexual orientation, and whatnot. That's how we would protect merit, or I would suggest we help protect merit in Afrolantica. After that, we're going to talk about the African part of Afrolantican jurisprudence. If I'm going to say that equal protection in Afrolantica should be expanded to include asymmetrical market imperfections, well, then where does that come from? How is that based from America or Africa? Right? Why even include that term, Afrolantica? Well, I intend to prove that the linchpin between critical race theory is anti-subordination, and the linchpin between all of the great civilizations in Africa. When we talk about Egypt, when we talk about Mali, Ghana, Songhai, when we talk about the great civilizations, Khan and Borno, Nubia, Monomotapa, and whatnot, that when we're at our greatest is when our acceptance of different groups within society is widest. That back in Egypt or ancient Kemet, that women had a full personality as early as the Old Kingdom. That there was a respect for due process and of law for every individual, regardless of wealth. Again, was a certified feature of Egyptian jurisprudence in the Old Kingdom. So if we're talking about Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, Hellenic Egypt, we're talking about the oldest of times when it's at its most African, right? And so if we also look through history, the great civilizations of Mali, Ghana, Songhai, again, we have a great respect for foreigners and people that have difference, right? And we're going to talk about that as support for the concept that Afrolantica would have a very broad concept of equal protection and therefore respond in some way when it's determined that law and regulation has asymmetrical market imperfections that produce group subordination. Let's have some fun with it. Let's for me to talk about African civilizations, you hear it on the internet all the time, and you hear it without sources, you hear it without background, and so you can be very skeptical. So what I'd like to do, this is one of the fun things about taxes. Taxes are very real, right? They produce a lot of positive evidence. Positive evidence of your civilization's existence and its position in the world. Because if one polity taxes another, then we have a power relationship. We know that this society basically had dominion over this another society, right? Or if that society was turned around a couple hundred years later and now has to pay taxes to someone else, then we know that society has lost its power, right? That it has been subordinated by another. So in that way, taxes, and who has to pay taxes? That lets you know who has the power in society, because the powerful in society will always try to avoid taxes and then heap taxes on those in society that has less power. So when you study taxation in ancient Africa, to me, it just becomes that much more real. You're not talking about jungles and whatnot. We're talking about roads. We're talking about commerce. We're talking about trade. We're talking about shipping. We're talking about taxes, toll, government administration. Think about it. We're talking about 5,000 years ago, that in order to have successful trade, there has to be roads, there has to be protection, there has to be defense and whatnot, and there has to be taxes to pay for it, which means the rulers have to give over the government to someone else who then administers it. And that person has to be either trusted or regulated in a way that produces money for the state. And we're talking about over 5,000 years. right? And so we're going to talk about taxes and government in pre-colonial African civilizations, what we know about ancient Egypt, the little we know about ancient Nubia, Meroe, and Kush. We're going to talk about ancient Ethiopia, talk about the tax systems of Axum, right? Most people don't talk about Axum. We talk about Nubia. We talk about Kemet in Egypt. But we don't talk about Axum, which became a huge world power in East Africa after Egypt's decline and carried us forward until we then had. Then we're going to talk about taxes and government in pre-colonial African civilizations and the early statehoods all over the continent. So we have information that because of the tax systems that we're going to call African feudal taxation, well, what happened is you have one central group that would attain power over a jurisdiction. And then there would be, let's say, 4 to 5 different districts and 4 to 5 different peoples that were governed by this central administration. What the monarch would do, or a traditional of African feudalism, and this is statehood across, because we're defining state as a central administration that governs over several different pieces, populations and polities and ethnic groups. And each one would be required to produce a craft, a metal, art, agriculture, or pastoralism, whatever, and all of them would have to pay taxes directly to the state. The state, however, would then do what? Turn around and redistribute that which was taxed to those provinces that didn't produce it. That is how they're going to diversify the economy. That's how the province that produces cattle is then also going to get pottery, ironworks, etc. Right, so that is how economies were developed since Christ's birth. Right, we're not talking about since European colonization has ended. We're talking 2,000 years ago. That prior to statehood in Europe, we have several states in Africa that formed themselves through this method. It's very, 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 very early and something to be proud of. So from there, we're going to talk about taxes and government in pre-colonial African civilizations, West African empires. Before we talk about Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, we're going to talk about Benin, Yoruba, and others that, again, also incredibly followed basically the same system of feudal taxation, where the taxes were given to the state in different crafts and then redistributed distributed to the people in the different provinces to diversify the economy. It is absolutely amazing the unity in the way governments were created in that respect, and that also gives us a basis for saying that an expanded equal protection and a respect for economics is what would also be included in an Afrolantican jurisprudence, on top of course, a concern for justice in the abstract. We'll talk about taxes and government in pre-colonial African civilizations, i.e. Moorish North Africa and Spain. But from that point forward, we're going to move over to we'll move west and ask about race and taxes in the United States Constitution. It may surprise some of you to know, maybe not everybody, but the Constitution, number one, is a tax document. Number two, it's a slave document. We had a constitution before the United States Constitution. It was called the Articles of Confederation. So we have to ask ourselves, why did it had a provision for how it was to be amended. We operated under it for over 10 years, and then we just decided to throw it out. It's almost as if we just took the U.S. Constitution now and just put it in the trash and came up with something new. That's what they did with the Articles of Confederation. The reason why is because slavery and taxes. Right? If you don't have enough tax money to pay the people that sold you arms to win the revolution, then they're not going to sell you arms to win the next fight against the Iroquois or when the British come back on you, right? And so in order for the Articles of Confederation did not to give the federal government the power to tax. So the U.S. Constitution needed that power. That's what they mean when they say they need a stronger central government, the power to tax. It's always called a stronger central government. No, it's the power to tax. But the power to tax is also the power to destroy. So the South was not trying to join any union where the North had the power to tax slavery out of business. So they insisted on having more voting rights than the North. And that is how we get the 3/5 clause in the United States Constitution and other provisions related to slavery and taxes. Um, we'll talk about that. It's very interesting. We're going to talk about beyond federal the Constitution, how taxes played a role in the rise of white supremacy. White supremacy did not always exist. Did not always exist, as we just talked about with pre-colonial African civilizations. Europe was not always the premier place in the world. It's actually kind of late. So we're going to talk about how, in fact, taxes played a role in the rise of white supremacy in the United States, including how every state taxed, how slavery itself is first of all, slavery itself is 100% tax on labor. Let's start there. Slavery is a 100% tax on labor. From there, the slave owner is taxed by the government or the state government. That money is then redistributed to the rest of society. And then we have taxes on brokerage, insurance companies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it was ubiquitous. And then after that, we're going to talk about even the federal tariff and how that redistributed, some say, the majority of profits from the South to the North. So the North cannot complain that, oh, we didn't have own slavery, we didn't have slavery, we fought for the North, and therefore we're not complicit. A great amount of the wealth from slavery did in fact find its way to the North, and therefore reparation scholars and equal protection scholars that seek for past discrimination, please be cognizant of the tax laws that help create white supremacy in the United States. From there, we're going to be a little more hopeful, right? We're going to talk about taxes and the decline of white supremacy in the United States. It is my firm belief that white supremacy has been in decline in the world since 1901. Very, very slowly, probably imperceptibly to most. But yes, at one point, there's nothing moving without Europeans and their descendants getting paid in 1901. However, the last 100 years, it has been whittled at by the people of the world. Europe has been fighting amongst itself as far as World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, and how have taxes played a part in that? We're going to talk about the only amendment to the United States Constitution garnered by the Civil Rights Amendment is the amendment against poll taxes. We're going to talk about Bob Jones University, where the Supreme Court actually said that Congress does not intend for the IRS to subsidize racist schools. It's the first time and the only time I can think of that the Supreme Court said that Congress has a general intent not to exacerbate racism and race relations. It astounds me that, again, we as critical race theory theorists do not cite by Bob Jones for the proposition that federal laws should not cannot be interpreted in a way that exacerbates racial subordination. Hopefully, we'll pick up on that, but and there's some other support for it too. We'll talk about Jeffrey Parsons Miller and some other things as well. But after that, we're going to talk about. We're going to bring it back into the 21st century. So we talked about the 17th, the 18th, and 19th. If you notice, we're talking thousands of years, and finally we get into the 21st century. And so at that point, we're going to first talk about kind of setting it up, reparations and taxation, right? We know that reparations are not here. And if you ask economists such as William Sandy Garrity, economic equality probably is just not even going to happen at all if we don't see some type of reparations. But the question I asked and the question that I dealt with another Black nationalist legal scholar, Dr. Carlton P. Waterhouse, is, well, how would we construct, what would the reparations program be taxed? Could it be designed so that it avoids U.S. taxes? Could we use the U.S. tax code as a means to distribute reparations? Are there nonprofits? If we put, is there any bar to Black nonprofits that are created with reparations money? In other words, if we don't give the money to individuals, could we create an education fund, a scholarship fund, a business fund as reparations? And how would the tax IRS treat that as a nonprofit? What could it do? What could it not do to keep its 501c3 status if that was the goal? So we've talked about reparations and taxation. But then let's get into the 21st century and something that's really deep to my heart, especially now because we're dealing with all this police brutality and policing for profit and whatnot. And so I wanted to talk to folks, especially on this is how starving the beast, the neoconservative strategy, got us here, where we have Donald Trump as president, where we have this so-called alt-right or Nazi movement or whatnot. For me, the blame lays squarely at the feet of the neoconservative movement. I know not a lot of black scholars take aim at neoliberalism. I do not. Neoliberalism has its flaws for sure, but to ignore neoconservatism and its purposeful strategy of subordinating black folks as a group, in my opinion, to ignore that is strategically foolish. And so I want to take a very healthy amount of time to describe how starving the beast as a neoconservative strategy created the Black Lives Matter. In other words, it has been intentional over the last 30 years to deprive governments of the money they need to provide social services. That is the cutting of the taxes is designed to reduce government services because they know that politicians, as we see with healthcare, politicians do not want to cut away social programs. They know they're going to pay at the polls. So neoconservatives that want an old school, small amount of rich moneyed folks running the country, so-called plutocracy, they want to reduce social services because it just doesn't work on the poor. They just want the poor to work cheap, or if you want nobility, go towards military service. And so they've cut taxes incessantly for 40 some years, hoping that the beast will be starved so that they won't have the money to provide social services. And they've been right. Think about the school districts in Philadelphia and other places around the country that they've starved them of tax money to the point where they absolutely don't function in a way that produces what they're supposed to produce, to the point where even the people who rely on the services don't even want them anymore. It's a setup. It's a setup. But the problem is folks are very reluctant to cut out the social services. So what's left are budget deficits, huge budget deficits. And folks want to close those deficits any way they can besides formal taxes on wealthy people. So how do they fund these programs? How do they close these deficits? By raising taxes on black people in very informal and racist ways. The biggest way is policing for profit. Policing for profit, because we're having these budget deficits, police departments across the country are under pressure to raise money, not fight crime, but raise money. That their goals, ticketing, fining, levying all types of tolls and whatnot on people with no public safety mission. It's pure taxation. It's informal taxation and it's racist taxation because they are explicitly closing budget deficits by trumping up charges and more aggressively pursuing black citizens all over the country so that they can squeeze more money out of those who don't even have it to save those that already do and provide them with greater tax cuts and ensure their position on top of society. So we're going to talk about policing for profit. Think about it. Eric Garner is killed because he's selling bootleg cigarettes. What do we mean by bootleg cigarettes? They are untaxed cigarettes. So we're going to see more cigarette taxes, soda taxes, bag taxes, and all these urban cities to raise money on the backs of people who already don't make a lot and pay quite enough to society in a lot of different ways. To the extent there are greater amounts of taxes, we know that there's going to be greater amounts of confrontations with law enforcement. And so Mike Brown and Eric Garner were taxed to death. And that's where we're going to get how starving the beast helped create the Black Lives Matter movement. We're going to talk more specifically about that stuff. We're going to talk about voter suppression as 21st century poll taxes, as voter ID laws, closing down polling places. Everything that they're doing to burden you, to keep you from voting, is a cost. And at a certain point, it is a financial cost. And if it is a financial cost, it ought to be considered a poll tax. And poll taxes, as we mentioned, are against the Constitution. So we're going to talk about that. But then we're going to talk about, instead of, again, criticizing the system as it is, how do we now take advantage of the code so such that we're less reliant on others? How do we use the United States tax code and federal laws, create wealth, to create black capital accumulation so that we are less vulnerable in the society, so that we can make this less of a soft racial caste system by increasing our capital so that we can be equal, not just in life and liberty, even though that's still a struggle, but as far as property as well, because the distance between us as far as property is even greater than it is with respect to liberty and life. So we're going to talk about taxes and investments. We're going to talk about some of the work that Dorothy Brown and others have done about whether or not we're efficiently using the tax code as in its favor and its subsidies for financial investments. Now, we're going to talk about how we can do it more efficiently, but I also want to take that particular chapter or episode to talk about combating the myth of black inferiority, because there seems to be, or there clearly is, an assumption from the very beginning that we don't invest well, or we don't participate in this economic system as well as others. And the fact is, it's just not true. That when we account for intergenerational wealth and the luxury, the information, the capital, both financial, social, and political, that comes with it, that we are doing just as well, if not better than others, given our circumstances, not given our income. Because if you compare black people and white people based on income, yeah, it looks like we're crazy. We don't do the things that they do to advance economically. But that's because the black folks and white folks of equal income are not similarly situated because of generational wealth accumulation. Black folks and white people of the same income, whites have 4 to 5 times more wealth accumulated, savings, and therefore can make decisions based on housing and investments with a nest egg, not just current income. And so we're going to talk about that in that episode. From there, we're going to talk about a really interesting issue that has to deal with, again, race, taxes, and all of you out there, and that is whether to chase whitey as far as real estate is concerned. Dorothy Brown, again, has done work that says that, or reported on work that definitely shows that buying houses in white neighborhoods, in very wealthy white neighborhoods, brings a higher rate of return than it does in buying in black neighborhoods. So that begs the question, do we, if we're trying to close the gap economically, does that require us to buy houses in wealthy white neighborhoods to chase whitey to basically try to gentrify or colonize their neighborhoods? Or does that mean we should buy the block to invest in black neighborhoods and try to build them up from the ground up? Because the consequence of chasing whitey is that you move to a white neighborhood, but the statistics already show that if more than the neighborhood becomes more than 10% black, then white flight occurs, which means that black person that moved into that white neighborhood is also going to have to flee from his brothers and sisters again and move again to a whiter neighborhood until that becomes 10% black, and then move again. So do we continue to chase white folks into the suburbs or wherever they might go, or is it better to plant your feet, take a brace, and to buy and build the block? Again, it's probably some combination of both, which is what we're going to come conclusions will come to a lot of time if we're going to be pragmatic. But then we're going to talk about taxes and black capital accumulation as far as entrepreneurship as well, right? We have black capital accumulation as far as investments. We're talking about real estate investments, but then entrepreneurship. We are not taking advantage of the Internal Revenue Code and the subsidies it has for entrepreneurship. So that is a discussion we're going to have as far as how black lawyers can team up with black people and help create greater, not just financial capital, but social capital and political capital by creating more and more and more black business. Every black person I know is good at something. I don't know what it is, but I don't care if you know the most about spiders of any person on the East Coast. You're good at something, and to be able, and with a business card, a website, a tip jar, it's so much easier to start one's own business, or as we call in the tax code, an activity engaged in for profit, such that you can deduct those expenses towards making money instead of just wasting them away as a regular quote unquote hobby. This distinction between hobby and an activity engaged in for profit is a legal one, and one in which we as Black lawyers need to help our people navigate and more successfully and more efficiently take advantage of the code, and therefore close this huge wealth gap. So those are, I don't know, a lot of the topics that we're going to talk about when it comes to race, taxes, and legal infrastructure. From there, we're actually going to actually teach law, right? From there, we're going to talk about why go to law school. And even for those that don't want to go to law school, I want to bring law class to you. No, it will not be designed for you to work in a law firm. There's going to be subtle differences. If the goal was to send you to a law firm, I would teach it in a particular way, in the way that I teach in law schools. But to the extent that you're interested in what the law is, whether it's right, whether it's wrong, the structure, what is the better system, that requires a different type of teaching. So we're going to do this online. We are going to talk about basic government law. I'm going to teach you legal systems as a basic primer, as far as the legal systems of the world, or a generalization as to legal systems of the world, and specifically in the United States. And then we're going to take constitutional law and go through the doctrines that we do go in law school, but then talk about them from, again, a black nationalist or Afrocentric perspective. We're going to talk about legislation, how it's created, how it's crafted, talk about administrative law. Again, from the perspective of Afrolantica, if we are looking for the better system, whether it's here or elsewhere, then we need to study constitutional law, administrative law, jurisprudence, legislation with a particular perspective, with an idea of what is it. I need to know what it is so I know what's wrong with it, and not just so I can criticize it, so that I can come up with the better system. From there, we're going to talk about, we're going to teach some basic commercial law, property law, contract law, and of course, tax law. When it comes to financial wherewithal, to me, those are the three biggies. And we're going to talk about just all the things that I've taught in law school. We're going to talk about it here. But again, here and there, we're going to add a black nationalist or an Afrocentric perspective, one that I basically don't teach in law school because that's not the aim there. I will also bring in some guest lecturers. At a certain point, we're going to bring in some folks to teach you criminal law, criminal procedure, tort law, civil procedure, and family law. Those are not subjects that I feel I have an expertise in, so we're going to bring in some guest lecturers. We're going to have a team of scholars here at Afrolantica.com eventually, and I think it'll be very fruitful and we'll learn a lot. But going back to maybe some less, those are the fundamental courses. We'll do some other law courses that I know a lot of you will be interested in. Sports and entertainment. I've taught that for 14 years. So we will have courses on copyrights and trademarks. I know a lot of you are interested in that type of stuff. I've talked to you personally, and so I know you're interested in that. We're going to talk about antitrust law. We'll talk about sports law generally, entertainment law generally, hip hop in the law. As a matter of fact, we can talk more specifically about Department of Sports and Entertainment. I'll bring in other lecturers to talk about other, I guess what we would call in law school elective courses, such as environmental law, human rights law, education law. But then also we will also deal with classes in legal theory, because that's my thing. So general jurisprudence, critical race theory, law and economics, and I will probably bring in a guest lecturer to teach Black feminist legal theory and intersectionality, because I think that's hugely important to also bring into an Afrolantican jurisprudence, because one of the things that we're going to learn from pre-colonial Africa is that we had more female rulers and monarchs and participation in the structure of government than anywhere else in the planet. So that is the plan. That is our schedule. That is what we intend to do. This is your introduction to Afrolantican jurisprudence. I thank you for spending this hour with me. God bless, and then talk to you very soon. Goodbye.